Hello and welcome to the FATBOSS guide to Uu'nat, Harbinger of the Void on Mythic.
Yes, this fight is probably the hardest encounter so far this expansion. However, it has received a few nerfs that do make it significantly easier. It does, however, still require a strong understanding of key mechanics to get through it. Phase 1 is all about positioning, Phase 2 requires perfect add damage management, and Phase 3 is a rush to the finish, where you must kill the boss before you're overwhelmed with adds, oblivion tears, and insatiable torment debuffs. Composition also plays quite a large factor in this fight, however it is relatively flexible. Would recommend to not run more than 4 melee, and when choosing your melee, just go for the maximum single target damage classes, and if you can choose those classes that can teleport over beams as well, such as rogues, that's a really good choice. For range, you want a mixture of AoE and classes that benefit from single target from having multiple adds up, such as elemental shamans. Warlocks are also extremely strong here, as they're an awesome class for dodging the beams, they're good for add damage, and their phase 3 survivability takes a lot of pressure off of the healers. People like Warlocks so much here that some guilds stacked over 10 of them for a first kill. Now we wouldn't recommend going that far personally, especially after the boss has been nerfed, and rate a more balanced comp higher. We use 3 Warlocks, 3 Elemental Shamans, 2 Shadow Priests, a Mage, a Boomkin, and a Hunter. If you were to min-max more, ideally the Hunter and Boomkin would have either been a Warlock or a Shaman, but as I said, the comp doesn't have to be perfect. As for tanks, Monks are definitely best by far, as they're awesome for dodging beams and also dealing with high damage from the adds. We used a Monk and a Warrior for the melee buff. As for healers, it's relatively flexible. The fight doesn't really have any major incoming damage aside from the beams and the gift casts. The timers on these abilities are extremely accurate and as a result are easy to predict, making ramp classes like Disc Priests and Druids pretty powerful here. Blessing of Protection is also very useful as it can be used on the add tank, yet he will still keep aggro, completely mitigating all add damage whilst it's up. We personally use 2 Disc Priests and a Paladin, however Disc Paladin Druid is relatively popular, so is Disc Druid. Some guilds also opt to 4-heal the fight using a Resto Shaman with IP traits. We tried this for 50 pulls or so and didn't find it that useful to have extra cooldowns for phase 3 and just went back to 3 healing again, but it's something that you might want to consider for your guild. But either way, moving away from comps, let's talk about the abilities.
So mechanically the fight is similar to Heroic, everything just deals way more damage, or in the case with Oblivion Tears, heals the boss for far more. There is however one major ability added to the fight in all 3 phases, which is Unstable Resonance. This 4-second cast from the boss is on a strict timer. When the cast is finished, 12 players in your raid will be debuffed for 15 seconds. This will prioritise range players first, which is the reason why you don't want to have a large amount of melee. 4 players will be debuffed with Ocean, 4 with Void, and 4 with Storm. When the 15 seconds time out, the player will take a 700k burst of damage, which will one-shot them without an immunity, and also splashing this damage to all players within 10 yards. The damage effect will also occur if the player moves on top of another player that has a non-matching debuff or relic. The only way to remove the debuff is by standing on top of the matching relic, whether they're on the ground or have been picked up by a player. You need to counter this ability in different ways depending on what phase you're in, as sometimes the relics have been picked up, such as in phase 1, or on the ground, such as phase 2, or you have a mixture of both, such as in phase 3, following a new rule set each time so it's executed safely. The only thing that's consistent in all phases is that you must pre-spread beforehand. This mechanic is the hardest part of the entire encounter and is likely to be the reason for the majority of your wipes, especially in your early pulls. We use weak auras that shout your debuff type above your head. This combined with the colour of the targeting circle around you and the animation around your character is enough for other players to clearly see what debuff you have. People holding relics also use a weak aura to shout to the rest of the raid to show clearly where they are stood. Note that boss mods also do this now, so you may want to use that instead. The only other change in the fight is applied to all of the adds. They now gain stacks of Hunger for the End. This increases their damage and movement speed by 10%. At 10 stacks, they can no longer be crowd controlled or interrupted. This just means that all of the adds deal far more damage, and the adds in phase 2 must be killed before they reach 10 stacks. The Undying Guardians will now also gain energy, and at 100% they'll cast Feed. This deals a burst of damage to the tank and heals the Guardians for 40% of their maximum health. This fortunately doesn't time badly with the points in the fight where they need to die, it just means that if you don't kill them at the right time, they're going to be even more of an issue to finish off. With all of that out of the way, let's begin to break down phase 1.
So positioning is key in this phase. Ranged DPS and healers are stood towards the western side of the room. Warlocks are also stood on the western side with portals pre-placed. These positions are for beams. The beams will always come in the exact same formation. If the raid stands on this side of the room, they have plenty of time to let the first beam go through them and let their dot drop before the second beam gets even remotely close. As for the Warlocks, they can simply portal and avoid the damage completely. As for the boss, he's kept in the middle of the room as much as possible. This is to make sure that everyone has range on it. This does also make the beams a little annoying for melee and tanks, and may force them to move around a bit to avoid gaining 2 stacks, but ultimately if only the tank gets hit from the boss's frontal cone, it's not a big deal if the boss moves 10 yards here or there. As for the adds, they are tanked towards the ranged group. Add damage in this phase should be limited to only players that gain single target damage off of them. For us, this was only flame shocks from the shamans and agony from the warlocks, if they could ever get in range of them. The idea is to completely ignore them and kill them off on the transition, just like you've done on heroic. Whilst in formation, it is important that your ranged DPS and healers keep a close eye on the Oblivion Tear timers. You want to bait these close to the edges of the room and importantly away from the Warlock portals. We use a very intrusive weak aura to help with this. As for the Void Crashes, they're soaked when at their smallest size, or when a large personal cooldown has been used. Anyone and everyone should look to soak them if they land nearby. As for the rest of the phase, it's just about pre-planning and watching timers. The noteworthy overlap is beams into marks into gift. This requires you to stand in a location that prevents you from gaining 2 stacks of the beam, pre-spreading immediately afterwards for the marks, whilst also taking into consideration that the room is about to get smaller, so you need to move away from the edges. We have exact timers and overlaps in a Google Doc that can be found in the description of the video. So what's the rules for the marks in this phase? The Storm is picked up by a mage, the Void is picked up by a healer, and the Ocean by one of the tanks. You want this tank to go second on the boss, because it lines up better with mark timers this way. Now as marks are being cast, we pre-spread. The Void is always close to the range camp, the Storm is typically behind the raid towards the entrance of the room, and the Ocean is usually found with the adds. As the marks come in, everyone stands perfectly still. If a player very close to you has the same mark, you stand together. This is to give more room for other players to move around you. Ocean, or blue, is given highest priority. They should always be allowed to move first, straight towards the tank. Void, or purple, is second on priority. Once the area is clear of blues, they move straight towards the Void. And as for the Storm guys, or yellow, they stand still in one big clump, or multiple clumps if they were blocked by blue or purple guys, and the mage will run over to clear them. This is repeated throughout the entire phase until you reach the transition. Once you've got the boss of 70% health, he'll transition. Ideally, you'll want to push this soon after the second set of beams. If you're too slow, you have to deal with the marks during the intermission, which isn't impossible, it's just not ideal. On the intermission, the Mage of the Storm moves towards a pre-placed yellow marker, the tank moves to blue, and the Void can pretty much stand anywhere. These marks are directly in the middle of the room, placed around 15 to 20 yards apart. Both the Ocean and Storm are used almost immediately after the boss transitions, and the entire raid swaps to kill off the adds. It is at this point, or just before it, where the tank with the adds might need to use CDs or perhaps even a bop. Just as phase 2 begins, the tanks are given large shield from the Disc Priest or with trinkets, and the Void Relic is used as we begin to soak the Oblivion Tear patches. The healer with the stone soaks 2 patches and then waits. The remaining patches are soaked by random players. Rogues are actually pretty good at this because they can cloak and not get knocked back. The new patch that spawns is assigned to one of the shamans, whichever has Ankh ready. Importantly, he is not healed at all after this point. When the first unknowable Terror Slam spawns, the healer with the Void Relic moves into it and positions himself close to the middle of the room, but keeps distance from the other relics. These are the new positions to remove marks throughout the phase. The slam will land, breaking the Voidstone shield on the healer, dropping the relic on the ground. The healer is then dispelled and gripped back towards the raid. You can now argue this is where phase 2 properly begins.
So this phase plays out the same way as heroic, except you have very awkward timings with marks and adds. As for positioning, the boss is faced towards the eye at the top of the room, and the raid spreads randomly around the outsides. Oblivion Tears throughout this phase are baited away from the middle of the room. It doesn't really matter where, just as long as they're 20 yards or more away from the relics and you should be good. Just don't go too close to the edges, as otherwise you may struggle to avoid the unknowable Terror Slam if it spawns directly on top of you. When marks come in, we use the exact same priority system, with Ocean going first, then Void, then Storm. However, because you're so spread and Storm is now on the ground rather than it being on the mage, everyone has to move. We try to use an imaginary tramline system here where Ocean has priority of the inner circle close to the relics, Void uses the middle, and Storm uses the outer. That way, typically players can move towards the relics without accidentally hitting someone of the opposite mark. This isn't always perfect, and sometimes you will need to stand still to make way for higher priority players, but you still have plenty of time to deal with it. As for the adds, it's all about interrupts and having damage in the right place. You only need to deal with 3 sets of adds in this phase, 2 during it and 1 during the next intermission. The adds have no new mechanics, they just have far more health and deal far more damage. We set up a 4-man ranged interrupt rotation on each of them, using boss mods to mark them as they spawn. The first interrupt is done almost immediately, and our monk tank uses a statue to bring them all towards the middle. All following interrupts are done late. When it comes to killing the adds, you'll of course want to use the Storm Relic when they're all below 25% health, including the Undying Guardian. If the entire raid swaps to the adds and you use the Storm the moment they reach that threshold, it's likely that you're going to have an entire Storm Relic cast go through, and this is bad for two reasons. One, it significantly reduces boss damage, as DPS are going to be dealing 50% less damage while the Storm is active, and two, it's a lot to heal, when healers really in this phase should just be regenning. For the first set of adds, they're brought to 25% health around the time the second Unknowable Terror comes in. The Shaman that soaked the last Oblivion Tear puddle as you transition picks up the Storm Relic just after the first marks are done, and then waits for the Unknowable Terror to spawn. Just before it slams, he starts the Storm, instantly killing the adds, and then dies to the slam damage, as he hasn't been healed up from the initial Oblivion Tear soak. If done correctly, the entire raid is only hit by a single tick of the Storm, and the Shaman can immediately yank after he has died. To get ad damage right for this, you have to play around with it, and it can take some time. We fine-tuned it to the point where some of our elemental shamans were earthquaking the adds, whereas others were earthshocking. Some of the melee were on the Undying Guardian, some of them were not on adds at all, and we were still min-maxing this all the way up to our kill. Just know, if all DPS go on the adds, you'll be way too fast and you won't have enough damage on the boss to transition him in time, and if not enough DPS is on them, then you won't have the damage to kill them during the slam, and the guy with the Storm Relic will have to use the darkness on the outside of the room instead to drop low, which isn't ideal. As for the second set of adds, you will have to use the darkness, as the slam doesn't line up here very well. Just as the second set of adds spawn, you need to bait for a tear. Once the patch spawns, you'll then want to immediately pick up the Storm, and then move into the darkness around the edges of the room and get low. It ticks really fast and really hard, so you want to be careful not to kill yourself. Moving out just as you reach around half health usually works pretty well. You'll then want to move towards the middle of the room again, ready to use the Storm and die not too far away from where you initially picked it up. After you've died, wait for the next gift and then you can ank. If you ank too early, you potentially are just going to die again. Soon afterwards, you'll have a new set of marks and you can just plow all damage into the boss from this point. Now when you transition the boss at 45% health, the third set of adds will spawn. Instead of forcing this spawn, we instead opt to wait for them. This for us meant we had to stop boss damage on most pulls. This allows a little more time for us to get the adds stacked and get some damage in on them. If you push the boss and you're unlucky with ad spawn locations, then it can actually be difficult to kill them without severely delaying the Storm Relic usage, which will completely fuck over your damage in phase 3. Just like the previous transition, we use Ocean here again and Storm on top of their markers. As for the Void, it is picked up by a Holy Paladin and used immediately when phase 3 begins. He runs into the darkness around the edges of the room until the shield has around 100k remaining on it, and then stands on top of the boss tank on the purple marker, waiting for the cleave to come in and remove the Void Stone from him. Meanwhile, the rest of the raid just clears up patches. At the same time, we lust, use our 3-minute cooldowns, and our second pot.
Right, so phase 3. This phase is done much like phase 1 when it comes to positioning. You do, however, need to pay far more attention with tears. You want to place these as close to the edges as you can, making the most of the space in the room, ideally overlapping them if you can. This again doesn't need to be perfect, but the better you do it, the more space you'll have to deal with other abilities such as the marks, and also more time you can spend in this phase. As for the marks, the first set are done like phase 2, with all the relics being on pre-placed markers from the intermission, so here you'll want to use the imaginary tramlines. However, after the first 2, the Void can be picked up again by the healer, bringing it back to the raid like phase 1. Now the Storm will be picked up and used like phase 2, however instead of the player dying to the darkness or a slam, they die to the Insatiable Torment debuff and sometimes the beams. This is done 3 times throughout phase 3, killing 2 adds each time, and it is the hardest part of the phase. It requires perfect timing with the Insatiable Torment debuff, moving out and away from the raid early enough that the Storm usage instantly kills you. But you can't move too early as you'll die before the Storm can be cast, or too late that you won't instantly die and instead will just pulse damage on the raid for too long, ultimately wiping you in either case. So after the first 2 marks, you want to use a mixture of imaginary tramlines and phase 1 priority system. Storm just need to be quick to move after Ocean and Void is finished. As for the dealing with the Insatiable Torment debuffs, we form small groups. 2 players in each circle will keep the player from losing health. 3 players will heal them. More than 3 players and you're just making it harder for your healers. When marks come in, you've got to give those players with the Insatiable Torment debuff space. You need to stay stacked with them throughout the cast, and then just 1 second before you need to spread from them. After the marks have been applied, you want to restack on them if you share the same mark, and run with them to keep them alive. If you don't do this, then potentially they'll die before they reach their mark, because they will not have anyone to leech health from. If a leech player dies in this phase, don't panic. On our kill, every single leech player died at some point and we still killed the boss. You just want to make sure you keep them up for as long as you can do safely to keep damage incoming on the boss. But you got to recognize if you have 3 or 4 leech debuffs up and the raid is getting decimated because all of the incoming ticking damage, it's fine just to let them go and die by themselves. Just make sure that you have some leech players available to use the relic when you want them to.
So let's show the key points throughout the phase with the adds and the storm relic usage. The first ad will spawn shortly into the phase. You'll want to ignore this ad for the most part, apart from again the same DPS that was using them as a single target damage increase from phase 1. The second ad will spawn shortly after the first set of beams. At this point, you'll want almost all of your ranged DPS to swap to it and get it low. At this point, we also assign one of the 2 active Insatiable Torment debuffs to be the Storm user. The marks will come in and are dealt with very quickly, and after the marks are finished, the Insatiable Torment guy will go pick up the Storm and moves away from the raid. He then uses the Storm, killing both ads as well as himself just before the next set of beam comes in, and ideally this will only tick on the raid once. The next ad will then come in around the exact same time. When the second ad comes in not too long afterwards, again ranged DPS need to swap to it, and ideally a new Insatiable debuff player is assigned to go pick up the Storm. We instead just used our raid leader even though he had no debuff. This set of ads needs to get destroyed as your window to kill them off is far smaller than the first. Your goal here is to get both ads to 25% health as the next set of beam comes in, allowing the player with a Storm relic to use it as the beams hit him, killing the ads and the Storm player instantly. Luckily for us, the raid leader also got an Insatiable Torment debuff at the exact same time. The next ad will spawn shortly after the beams have passed, and the second ad will spawn on the next set of beams, and again ranged DPS need to swap to it. For the last set of ads, you'll want to do it just like the first, having a leech player move out and drop low, timing it with the ad's health as well as his own health, so only a single tick goes through. We, however, just decided to battle res our raid leader and just get him to use it again. After this point, you can now completely ignore ads and just plow damage into the boss. Dotters should, however, keep some form of ad damage up, as it will help reduce some of the damage incoming on the tank. So from this point here, you've just got to make sure that you do not get 2 stacks of the beam, you do not fail all the marks, and just hope the boss dies before the tank becomes overwhelmed with a third ad, as well as of course not soaking any puddles. If you soak any in this last phase, it's 100% a wipe. The damage requirement to pull this off isn't very tight, especially if you manage to keep the leech players alive for a while, but towards the end of the encounter you are eventually going to run out of space because of all the patches. But that does depend entirely how well you baited them from the start. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about the fight, but we do have a Google Doc in the description of this video that shows exact healing cooldowns and timers of important spells, as well as weak auras that you can copy and make your own, which you should find useful while progressing this boss.
Now, if you'd like to know more about this encounter or just have a handy sheet to refer to during your progression, then do go check out our written guide over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all very soon with the previews of the next raid. Take care.
Thanks for watching.